My grandmother lost her husband quite early on. My mother was about 19 years old or 21 perhaps when she lost him. And she also lost her son who was differently abled around the same time. She came from a house, she was a Christian woman married into a Hindu household, and they were friends before marriage, and I won't complicate that by explaining what that exactly means. He was friends with her brother, and so they got married, and she was a teacher who taught English, a language that she came to learn only when she was in the 6th standard at that time. You have to remember that in those days English wasn't taught to you from kindergarten. And this absolutely crazy, slightly temperamental but really strong-willed woman lived alone in this very city that we occupy. For a part of the time my brother was raised with her, but and thereafter she lived alone, but was surrounded by an intimacy to students that she continued to teach till the end of her days. She gave tuitions in English and social studies, and her plants. In some sense, my insistence on teaching comes from the kind of impact I saw she made on her students, which is not to say that I have in any sense been able to achieve a minuscule of what she does or learn much of her technique. She was very strict. She was much of a disciplinarian. I mean, if you had to come to my grandmother's tuitions, you had to cut your nails, you had to be well dressed, your hair pulled back off your face, you had to sit in a particular posture, and you were not just taught English, but you were taught how to write properly. Handwriting was really important to this woman, and to draw and paint. So every Christmas she would only accept handmade cards from her students. So there was an idea of education which I have clung to, which is slightly more than simply doing your books properly, whatever that may be. In fact, she is also doing her books properly. Anywho, so for an old woman in this city, she managed quite beautifully. In fact, when she used to come over to our house as well, she would spend the weekend, and on the third day she'll be like, my children are waiting for me, which meant both the children that she would teach and the children that she had raised as green and her plants, and so they required looking after. In some sense, there was an ethic of personal living which I admired deeply, an ethic that was a cultivation of both the body and the mind. She was rigorous in terms of her routine. Her favorite word was systematic and methodical. So those are words I cling to. I may not have reached them. So in sense, an ethic of personal living has come from my grandmother. My mother became single when she left my father, threw him out, when I was 6 years old. And at that time, both my brother and I made the decision of staying with my mother. This woman, to be a single woman, young and single, is slightly difficult. Plus, that meant that because she had a government job that she got, because at that time the government would give you a position once somebody in the family died in terms of service. So my mother got her job in lieu of her father who had passed away. So we were staying in government accommodation. She still stays in a government accommodation, and she raised us on very meager resources. So in some sense, both learnt gratitude and hardship really quickly. And I think that she also had a certain idea of what meant the richness of life. So in some sense, her idea of life, so for somebody who's not earning much, the idea of life should be to have bare minimum. But that was never her idea of life. Her idea of life was in some sense, what luxuries are possible in the bare minimum. So spending constantly on books, spending constantly on chips and things like that. Things that made you, so things that of course depleted the savings of the house, but things that made a life slightly, even as you lived bare minimums, happy. Right? So there is a certain idea of happiness that is different from an idea of happiness that you would imagine for a single woman raising 2 kids. So one learnt very clearly how the world was divided according to gendered and classed lines. I went to a private school that my mother could only ill afford and paid through her teeth, but one that she would take loans for and then repay, etc., etc. Quite an amazing woman in terms of her ability to negotiate the world as a woman who was brought up in a rather protected environment. And so I learnt very quickly that the world was divided according to gendered and classed lines, seeing the lives of women and not necessarily seeing the lives of LGBT people or poor people, but seeing a lower middle class household struggle raised by single women, my brother being raised by my grandmother and I being raised by my mother, but always finding in those moments new conceptions of what it meant to be happy. Celebrating Christmas, I mean in our house till my grandmother was alive. This grandmother is my mother's mother. Till my grandmother was alive, Christmas was a bigger deal than Diwali. And so by the time Diwali would end, the next day you are planning for Christmas. Diwali was planned for in a week and done over with, but Christmas required major planning. And so and Christmas meant, because she lived in a mostly Hindu society, it meant that it was an open house. So everybody was invited for a cup of coffee, cake, and my grandmother was an exquisite cook, and so food, right? And so an idea of community-based happiness, an idea of non-individuated living, and an idea of the difficult ways in which this world is arranged and therefore needs to be negotiated. It was in some sense obvious when a paper in my BA was offered on feminism that I jumped on it. I had a very superficial understanding of feminism, which I still hold on to in some sense, that women are superior to men. I still hold on to that idea, and that the world is not in favor of women, and what it requires is a conception of the world that is not made by men. And so those ideas in some sense don't leave me. And those ideas are foundational to how I came to, if there is anything that is foundational in the world, to feminism. Which is where I began my journey both to queer politics and to left politics. Feminism has taught us very well that the personal is political. And a lot of philosophy actually has now come to be revealed that what was considered to be abstract philosophy by male political philosophers was deeply influenced by the kind of personal lives that they were leading. Marx was dependent on his wife for his resources. That sustained his writing. Many men write out of personal histories. No, I am not saying that the biographical is always already political, but that they are in some kind of relationship, a relationship that has to be nuanced from every position that you may write or talk. So that is my first on the personal and political. I have never for myself thought of myself as a cross-dresser, though I have been identified as that, and it is not an identification I give up, which takes me to the question about gender. I have never believed that gender is something that you define for yourself. I don't think anything that you do, you define for yourself. The world is always arranged for you in a certain way, and so you may take things, give them meanings that may make more sense or may feel more true to what you may believe, but are not meanings that you are in any position to give. So gender in some sense is, as we recognize, performative, And so it was when I discovered, in some sense, conceptions about performativity that opened up gender beyond the natural. That is, I feel more comfortable in this or that. I came to start wearing now what is called as dresses that go across gender boundaries. But for the longest time, even if I may not be in a sari, I was not your conventional dresser. I went through a phase where I was into goth, so I would only wear black, and I had a mohawk, which very few people can accept now. There was a point in my life where I was obsessed with wearing white shirts with blue jeans. And there was a point in my life where I made very bad choices about what counts as clothing. So in some sense, I was slightly eccentric in my dressing sense, so I would always be visibilized by what I was wearing. And so this is in some sense both an extension from and a rupture from that history of clothing. I love clothes. As a child who was going through a certain kind of hardship in life, clothes were a luxury. And so I think in some sense, and this is sort of, this might seem too biographical, but I will still do it, that in some sense I never had very good clothes, and so I always aspired for clothing. And so I have a deeply sentimental relationship to clothing, and that has continued. So I've always enjoyed dressing up, which is the difficult thing about gender that we forget. That gender is also something that you enjoy, even if as you may not get to decide what it is. So I enjoy what I wear. I invest in it slightly too much, but I do. And so in some sense, when I came to know of ideas of performativity, I realized that I could perhaps play with it in ways that were not as dramatic as somebody like Judith Butler would want us to do it, but in ways that still troubled what were conventional ideas of gender. So a sari is an interesting experiment to walk into the metro. So when you have a surveillance system which is clearly defined in the lines of men who wear trousers and or kurta pajamas and women who wear saris and suits, when a man wears a sari, it's both a moment of confrontation and a moment of possibility. That is, there is a possibility of a conversation that can happen that may not result in people now believing that everybody should trouble gender, but a slight discursive shift might be possible, and it is precisely for that possibility that I wear this. It's a possibility to ask for a moment in time where one could both confront and make possible. And so, which is why I believe that the sari might worked. I started to believe less now, but this may work now, but I do not think I will hold on to this idea anymore, because what may trouble gender might change, right? And so it's not always going to, so now it's quite conventional for men to be waxed and to wear pinks and a certain kind of gay boy aesthetic, a certain dandiness is quite acceptable in spaces around you, right? So men have this very what is very well made up hair, the slight James Dean look, which inspired a lot of, if you remember, if you would know anything, James Dean was an inspiration for butch lesbians to model themselves, and now it's come back to men again. But there is the tight pants, and there is the short t-shirt, and there's a certain smoothness to the men, a certain dandiness which has become conventional. So a gay boy aesthetic that may have troubled men before does not trouble them anymore. So if that shifts, I may give up wearing saris, though I may not give them up in toto. That is, I may not give up my saris, but I may give up wearing them. Everybody is constantly crossing genders. There is no way in which any of us fit perfectly well into the structures of gender that have been institutionalized. So all of you are constantly breaking the binary. It may not necessarily be through cross-dressing, it may not necessarily be through overt appearances, as you may put it, but it is part of our everyday lives that we are breaking the binary. It is not something that only hijras do, it is not something that only LGBT people do, it is not something that only cross-dressers do, and it is not something that only people like me do. It is something that each and every one of us do. And each of these are breaking the binary. Therefore, the question of resistance is difficult to answer, because mere crossing the binary or breaking the binary is not resistance, because everybody is doing it. If everybody is doing it, in some sense it is part of the structure that maintains. It is in fact this very negotiation with gender and this failing of gender, this breaking down of gender, that makes gender pleasurable, that makes gender exciting to us, that makes us own gender. Which is why since everybody now, in some sense it is common sense in university spaces like these and in universities where I teach, that gender norms are oppressive because they are social. But the negotiations and owning of gender, which are deeply personal, our own personal investments in gender, are precisely that which maintain gender. It's precisely why even as people recognize that norms must be broken down, they still do not want to give up genders. Right? If gender is such an oppressive thing, why isn't it that those who are convinced by it give it up? Because there is an amount of pleasure in owning our genders, right? So, and it is that pleasure that is as central to the maintenance of the structures of gender and sexuality as the policing by institutions that we find oppressive, whether the family, whether the Khap Panchayat, whether your Modi government, etc., etc., etc. So therefore, resistance must not only account for the idealized structures of gender, ones that we constantly fail doing, but also this deep ingrained pleasures of gender, living up to the ideal of the ideal son for their parents, the pleasures that it gives the parents when their child lives up to be the ideal son, when you are good students in the university and the rewards you get, etc., etc. For me, whereas a larger history of undoing gender by challenging social norms of gender has been recorded and has been called into resistance, I now look for resistances of this personal gender, of this personal investment in gender. For me, this is the future of gendered resistance. I am a teacher, and for the first time in my life, I am teaching undergrad students this year. I have only taught postgrad students ever since I started teaching many years ago. I've been teaching now for what seems like a lifetime, and I'm sure it seemed like a lifetime to my students. So we would, so this undergraduate course called Introduction to Gender is taught collaboratively with another colleague. So when the two of us were devising the course on how to do gender with undergrad school students who just come out of school, first year undergrads, first semester actually, we deeply resisted the idea that there is some linear way in which you move from simplistic understandings of gender to more complicated understandings of gender. Right? That nuance is something that you move into once you've got simple things down. I do not think in these linear ideas of development. That is, you move from the small itty bitty things and then you move into more difficult, complicated, complex things. This is one of the reasons why academia is at the position that it is. A friend of mine has, who's also at your university, has told me quite often that one of the reasons why I hate maths is that I was taught badly.
Yes.
And one of the reasons why students find themselves completely flabbergasted by what they learn at the graduate level or undergraduate level from the school is that you are suddenly made to revise your theories and your theorems again in the light of new data that's pushed into it. So suddenly you're like, wait, linear equations is this, algebra is this, we were taught something completely different. That is, the idea is that you will be taught you will be taught real algebra when you are in the undergrad, and you will be taught some shit that you will have to undo when you are at the undergrad, when you are in your school, right? I believe that one of the ways that you have to begin with nuance. Nuance is something that you can only risk to give up, and it is a double bind. That is, that nuance makes the job of doing politics or doing philosophy or doing any kind of personal personal living difficult, but it is also that which enriches, right? Both in my politics, I refuse to give up nuance. So I will not hold critique for a day later when we have won our rights. Critique is that which will inform the struggle towards rights and in fact will inform our identities. Identification will not be uncritical, and identification is never uncritical, and that is the other thing that we have to give up. Nobody generally, and this is a large generalization, identifies without nuance in their own living. You occupy gender, for example, with a certain critique, and people occupy their caste ideas with a certain critique. Who does not occupy it with certain critiques? People with privilege. So men may not necessarily have to do or think about critically occupying their genders. Upper caste people may not have to critically occupy caste. Upper class people may not have to critically occupy class. But anybody who is on the other side of this privilege has only and always already occupied and identified critically. And if you occupy multiple subject positions, then they run against each other and they are frictional. That is, my feminist politics pull me in one direction than my queer politics. And it is that friction, this constant critique of each other, that I find most productive. Both that undoes my politics and both that makes it all the more possible, right? So I do not think that we need to, I am not saying that we need to give up identity, but in what makes identification possible and on what grounds do we identify must be critically analyzed, even if we do not want to give up identity, because you have to realize that in the present structures of our society, people who give up identity are generally people with privilege, right? And so I am able to be this fabulous gender bending person because sometimes when I am going through a difficult day, I can choose to not take the metro and take an auto. That I can choose to not do those battles. This choice of deciding what day I will do a battle and what not is also sometimes privilege and sometimes strategy. In the present times, queerness has become in some sense synonymous with a certain kind of sexuality politics that I find is in its everyday life not very sensitive to the ways in which gender works. So it has both been a response to my thinking of the relationship between gender and sexuality, but also with regards to how I am seen. I am not necessarily seen as somebody who is sexually dissident only, but is also seen as somebody who is doing gender wrong, and therefore it is a title that was given to me by somebody else, and I don't resist any identification that somebody offers to me. So I have accepted it, and at many places quoted myself as genderqueer. Before this, I have been queer I've also been called intersex at some point by another friend, and it's not, I do not have any idea of that experience. I'm not biologically intersexed, but I have always wondered how intersexuality or being intersex might affect queerness, and that's a longer conversation for some other day. So I am constantly always accepting identifications that other people make possible, and seeing what possibilities that they might offer for my politics. The piece that you might have read of my critique of the queer movement has a number of positions that I have moved away from. I still hold that the queer movement has to constantly work on its gender politics. The nuance of those gender politics have shifted, much like what has come to be queer movement has shifted. Queer politics was not common sense. It's still not, but there is a widespread tolerance. I'll give you a small anecdote. I remember doing a presentation during my MA about rethinking the relationship of human rights to queerness. In the presentation, I decided to begin the presentation by what is famously called the heterosexual questionnaire. Anybody who's interested in it can find it online. You just have to Google heterosexual questionnaire. And I went carrying it to my class. It's a beautiful questionnaire because it asks the kinds of questions that you generally ask sexual/gender dissidents. So when did you turn gay, or when did you realize you like men, and if you haven't slept with women, how would you know? And turns it around to ask straight people. So when did you know you were straight? And if you haven't slept with men, how do you know you're straight? And things like that. So it's a very powerful polemical questionnaire that I carried to the class, thinking I'm going to be exciting and absolutely fabulous. And so when I went up to take that, do that presentation, I asked in my class of almost 200 people. An MA class in Delhi University is quite often those numbers, especially the humanities. It is precisely the workings of the queer movement that have even made straight identification possible. We are now clearly in a different time where everybody wants a gay best friend to go shopping with. So we need to rethink what we mean by queerness again, right? So it is in this sense that because what is now called queer is constantly shifting, that we need to constantly keep thinking about what we need to do more. One of the things that I have come to realize more is that for a large generation of young people who grew up into their sexuality or came to think about their sexuality in the years after decriminalization by the Delhi High Court in 2009. So these young 19 to 25-year-olds who are discovering their sexuality in a period there was no 377, find the law is back on the statute books, deeply depressing, right? So they're like, how are we going to live under section 377? It causes a panic. They are unable to imagine what lives under 377 might look like, that there are generations and generations of queer people who've lived under 377, difficult lives, but lives nevertheless lived. I think the present challenge for people who do queer politics, myself included, is how to speak to this generation, both that has access to global circulation of LGBT identities, but is not necessarily able to think politically in very much nuance. So a bunch of gay men, I know, young gay men, find it common sense that they must align with women, but are unable to bring feminist politics into their sexual politics. And they necessarily feel alienated from the queer movement and have started various kinds of groups that are deeply problematic but are what shaped their imagination. So in order to reshape their imagination, I think it is a large challenge for the queer movement to think about these people who find themselves alienated from what is called the queer movement. And I must, at a footnote, add, there is no one queer movement. I absolutely love pride parades. There are, especially because in India till now they have not been commoditized, they are not sponsored, they are organized by groups of people that come together every year, dissipate, a new set of people come together, etc., etc. So it's a deeply enlivening space to be in. It's constantly shifting. You constantly have to rethink your politics because of the kind of milieu you might find yourself in. So I absolutely love organizing pride and being at pride, etc. What I don't love is that it has become a space where you are now seeking comfort rather than disturbing, right? And so it has become more in the register of tolerance and acceptance than anything else. And I am constantly in every pride thinking about if we are being proud, who is being shamed, right? And so who is both within the pride and in the discourses of the pride being shamed? And so I have to constantly, and this is the issue that every pride has to think about, its own complicity in shaming and not simply in pride. It's not simply the institution of marriage, but I find institutions of monogamy and cultural ideas of what constitutes love as oppressive institutions. These are institutions that uphold certain kinds of structures, no surprise, patriarchy being one of them. And these are not structures that allow for deep negotiation. So there is a lot of idea that when gay men will get married, they will change marriage around. And I have constantly said that before you think you will change marriage, marriage will change you. That is the structure of the institution. In order to enter certain institutions, you must necessarily make yourself legible to them. So it is not simply that these institutions have a history of leaving people out and marginalizing people. So marginalizing by not giving equal access to what are institutions of privilege, like marriage. For example, Devdasis couldn't marry, and raped women still find it difficult to find partners. Single women have very difficult times living happy lives, etc., etc. So, and women are deeply are on the receiving end of much violence because of ideas of domesticity and companionship in marriage. So marital rape is still not recognized as violence in this country. But even this whole idea of that I must stick with this somebody because I love them, so I must tolerate their violence, or I must sacrifice for the good of this family, etc. I find all of these institutions of violence. But I recognize all institutionalization requires violence, right? And this is the double bind. How do you both negotiate with institutions and continue to undo their violence, even as violence may be central to how we think about various kinds of institutions? So let me give you a slightly more off answer to this question. I recognize gender to be deeply violent, but it does not stop me from organizing on grounds of gender. That is, that which is violent, that which is intrinsically violent, can also become the condition of new possibilities, of resistance, of reimaginations, bad word, of reimagining the world, right? And so, in some sense, my critique of marriage is that I do not find anything worth salvaging in the institution of marriage. There is a history of marriage where it has been oppressive. It is oppressive both within and by leaving people outside. But moreover, I recognize that violence as such cannot be something I can give up in toto. Alright? I think one of the ways in which we have to think about queerness as students is to recognize our complicity in what are present organizations of gender, sexuality, desire, and love. And I think one of the first ways in which students can start doing this is not only showing up at the pride marches and organizing events and interviews like these, but by rethinking their own investments in what is the structure and how they uphold it, right? And so one of the ways in which I think we have to rethink queerness is about even the queer person's own complicity in maintaining what is badly called in India heteronormativity. I do not think that concept is very useful when talking about Indian politics or Indian negotiations of gender and sexuality. But what is our own personal investment in heteronormativity? For example, why does the idea of spending a life with one person sound so beautiful to all of us, and why do we desire it constantly, right? Even as we may be critical of institutions of marriage, etc., why does the question of what will happen to us when we are old come to such simple, commonsensical understandings, right? Because merit is deeply Brahmanical. It's a Brahmanical concept, and so when you oppose reservations or grounds of merit, you are upholding a certain caste structure. So one of the ways in which all of us, straight allies, queer people, non-queer people, undecided people, have to think about queerness is by thinking about our complicity in various kinds of oppressive structures, alright? Whether by celebrating our parents' anniversaries or getting married ourselves.